What happens when one of Hollywood's most legendary actors walks into a daytime talk show expecting a friendly conversation, and instead finds himself in the middle of a tense confrontation that no one saw coming? That's exactly what happened when Harrison Ford sat down across the table from Sunny Hostin on The View. The audience had come for entertainment, a casual interview, some laughs, maybe a few stories from decades in Hollywood. But within minutes, the smiles were gone. Before we dive into this intense moment, make sure to subscribe to The Truth Narrator, like this video, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Because stories like this, moments when the calm surface of live television suddenly cracks, are exactly what we uncover here. The studio lights glowed bright across the polished table of The View. The familiar theme music had just faded, and the hosts were already leaning into their well-practiced rhythm of welcoming guests. Sunny Hostin adjusted the stack of notes in front of her. The audience clapped as Harrison Ford walked onto the stage. For decades, Ford had been known as one of the most iconic faces in cinema. To many viewers, he wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of adventure, rebellion, and quiet strength. From the moment he stepped out, the crowd erupted into cheers. Ford offered a brief wave. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a small nod of acknowledgement. That was his style. The hosts greeted him warmly as he took his seat. The early moments felt exactly as everyone expected. Light conversation. A few jokes about his legendary career. Someone in the audience shouted, "We love you, Harrison." He smiled slightly. "Thanks," he replied with his trademark dry tone. Laughter rippled through the crowd. For the first several minutes, the conversation moved smoothly. Stories about film sets, memories of difficult stunts, a quick reflection on how Hollywood had changed over the decades. Ford spoke calmly, sometimes with humor, sometimes with quiet seriousness. But then the tone shifted. Sunny Hostin leaned forward. Her voice was polite, but her question carried a different kind of weight. "So Harrison," she said carefully, "you've been in this industry for a very long time." Ford nodded. "That's one way to put it." The audience chuckled again. But Sunny continued. "And during that time, the industry has faced criticism for many things: representation, power dynamics, accountability." Ford listened quietly. His expression remained neutral. Sunny tapped her notes lightly. "Do you think Hollywood really learns from its mistakes?" she asked. "Or does it simply move on and pretend nothing happened?" The question landed heavier than the ones before it. The audience shifted slightly in their seats. Ford didn't answer immediately. He looked at Sunny, then briefly at the other hosts, then back to her. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I think Hollywood is made of people," he said. Sunny nodded. "And people make mistakes." Another pause. "But people also change," he finished. The audience applauded politely. It sounded like a safe answer. Diplomatic. But Sunny wasn't finished. She leaned forward again. "But some critics say change only happens when the public demands it," she said. Ford's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. More like concentration. "And your point is?" he asked calmly. Sunny smiled. But it was the kind of smile that meant the conversation was just beginning. "My point is," she said, "you've worked with some of the most powerful people in Hollywood. You've seen how the industry operates behind the scenes." The studio grew quieter. "Do you believe the culture of silence that once protected powerful figures is truly gone?" A ripple moved through the audience. Some people leaned closer. Others exchanged looks. Because now the conversation had clearly moved beyond movie stories. Ford sat back slightly in his chair. His face remained composed. But something had changed. The casual energy from earlier had disappeared. "You're asking a very broad question," he said. Sunny nodded. "Yes." Ford rested his hands together. "And I'm not sure it has a simple answer." Sunny didn't look away. "That's why we're asking you," she replied. A few audience members murmured quietly. The tension was becoming visible. One of the co-hosts tried to soften the moment. "Well, Harrison has always been known for speaking his mind," she joked. The audience laughed nervously. Ford gave a small half-smile. "Sometimes that gets me into trouble." Sunny leaned slightly closer to the table. "Well, today might be one of those days." The audience reacted with a mix of laughter and surprise. But Ford didn't laugh. He looked directly at her. "Is that a warning?" Sunny shrugged lightly. "Just a possibility." The room felt different now. Heavier. The cameras zoomed slightly closer. Ford's voice dropped a little. "You're trying to steer this conversation somewhere specific," he said. Sunny didn't deny it. Yes, she said plainly. The honesty caught the room off guard. The audience quieted completely. And where exactly is that? Ford asked. Sunny glanced briefly at her notes. Then she looked back up. To the question of responsibility, she said. For the culture that existed in Hollywood for so long. A wave of murmurs moved through the studio. Ford remained still, but his eyes had grown sharper. I'm responsible for my own actions, he said. Sunny nodded slowly. But do you think silence from respected figures, people with influence, allowed certain behaviors to continue? The tension in the room snapped tighter. A few audience members whispered to each other. This was no longer a friendly interview. It had become something else. Ford leaned forward now. For the first time since the interview began. His voice stayed calm, but it carried a different energy. You're asking me if I should have spoken out about things I may or may not have known, he said. Sunny met his gaze. Yes. The word echoed in the quiet studio. Ford exhaled slowly. Then he said something that made several audience members gasp. You're assuming a lot. Sunny didn't look away. And you're avoiding the question. The room froze. Because suddenly, the legendary calm of Harrison Ford had begun to crack. And everyone watching The View could feel it. The smiles were gone. And the conversation was only just beginning. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Inside the bright studio of The View, the audience sat frozen, watching the moment unfold between Harrison Ford and Sunny Hostin. Just seconds earlier, Sunny had said something that cut straight through the polite atmosphere of daytime television. And you're avoiding the question. The words hung in the air. For a brief moment, no one moved. Ford leaned back slowly in his chair, his hands resting on the table. His face remained calm, but the light humor that had colored the earlier conversation was gone. Now there was something sharper in his expression. Something thoughtful, but firm. The cameras zoomed slightly closer. Sunny watched him carefully, clearly aware that the conversation had crossed into deeper territory. Ford finally spoke. No, he said quietly. I'm choosing not to answer a question built on assumptions. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Sunny tilted her head slightly. What assumptions? She asked. Ford's voice stayed measured. The assumption that silence equals complicity, he replied. A few audience members nodded. Others leaned forward, sensing that this discussion was about to grow even more intense. Sunny didn't back away. But historically, she said, that's often been the case. Ford raised an eyebrow. Historically where? Sunny gestured lightly with her hand. In industries where powerful people protected each other. The words landed heavily. One of the co-hosts shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Another tried to break the tension with a nervous laugh. Well, this just got serious. But neither Ford nor Sunny reacted to the attempt at humor. The moment had moved beyond jokes. Ford leaned forward again, resting his arms on the table. Let me ask you something, he said calmly. Sunny nodded. Sure. Ford looked around briefly at the audience before returning his gaze to her. Do you think every person in a system understands everything happening inside that system? Sunny paused. No, she admitted. Ford nodded slightly. Then why assume that people who didn't speak out knew exactly what they were supposed to speak about? The audience murmured again. It was a fair question. Sunny folded her hands together thoughtfully. I'm not saying everyone knew everything, she replied. Ford watched her carefully. But, he asked. But I think people sometimes know more than they admit, she said. The room grew quiet again. Ford's jaw tightened slightly. You're suggesting something very specific, he said. Sunny met his gaze. I'm suggesting that influence comes with responsibility. The audience erupted with applause. Several people clapped loudly. Others simply watched the two figures at the table, fascinated by the growing tension. Ford waited for the applause to fade. Then he spoke again. Responsibility for what? Sunny didn't hesitate. For shaping the culture around you. Ford leaned back again. And you believe actors are responsible for shaping Hollywood culture? Sunny nodded slowly. They're certainly part of it. Ford's lips pressed into a thin line. Actors show up. They do their work. They go home. Sunny gave a small shake of her head. That might have been true decades ago, she said. But today celebrities have enormous influence. The audience nodded. Ford's expression remained serious. I've never believed fame makes someone morally superior, he said. Sunny smiled slightly. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying? Sunny leaned forward again. I'm saying that when people admire you, when they look up to you, your voice carries weight. The audience murmured in agreement. Ford sighed quietly. I understand that, he said. Sunny waited. But, Ford continued, there's a difference between using your voice and being expected to speak on every issue. The audience reacted with a mixture of applause and quiet debate. Sunny considered his words carefully. I agree, she said. Ford looked slightly surprised. But some issues, Sunny added, aren't optional. The tension tightened again. Ford studied her expression. And who decides which issues those are? He asked. Sunny paused. The question lingered. Well, she said slowly, society usually does. Ford shook his head slightly. That's a very convenient answer. The audience laughed softly, sensing the subtle sarcasm. Sunny smiled too, but her eyes remained focused. You've played characters who stand up for what's right, she said. Ford chuckled quietly. They were characters. But those characters inspired people, she replied. The audience applauded again. Ford rubbed his hands together thoughtfully. You're blurring the line between storytelling and reality, he said. Sunny shrugged lightly. Sometimes storytelling shapes reality. The room fell silent again. Even the co-hosts seemed captivated now. This wasn't just a celebrity interview anymore. It had become a philosophical debate about responsibility, influence, and public expectation. Ford leaned forward again. For decades, he said, people criticized actors for pretending to be experts on things they weren't qualified to discuss. Sunny nodded. That's true. And now, Ford continued, we're criticized if we don't speak up. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Sunny smiled slightly. That's the paradox of fame. Ford raised an eyebrow. Exactly. The conversation seemed to pause for a moment. But Sunny wasn't finished yet. She glanced down at her notes, then back up. There's another side to this, she said. Ford waited. Sunny took a breath. Many younger actors today are extremely vocal about social issues. The audience nodded. Ford didn't respond immediately. Sunny continued. They're advocating for change in ways previous generations didn't. Ford folded his arms. And you think my generation failed? The question came out sharper than before. The audience gasped slightly. Sunny blinked. That's not what I said. But it's what you implied, Ford replied. The tension in the studio became almost physical. Sunny shook her head gently. No, she said. Then she added quietly. I think every generation faces a different kind of pressure. Ford looked at her carefully. And what kind of pressure do you think mine faced? Sunny held his gaze. The pressure to protect the system that gave you success. The room went completely silent. A few audience members whispered. Others stared wide-eyed at the table. Because now the conversation had crossed another line. Ford didn't speak for several seconds. When he finally did, his voice was calm again. But there was steel in it now. You're painting a very simple picture of a very complicated world. Sunny nodded slowly. That's why we're talking about it. Ford leaned closer to the table. And what if that picture is wrong? The audience leaned forward. Sunny took a breath. Then I'm willing to hear why. Another silence followed. But this time it felt different. Because something in Harrison Ford's expression suggested he was about to say something far more personal than anything he had said so far. And if he did, the conversation on The View might turn into a moment the audience would never forget. The silence stretched across the studio like a held breath. Every eye inside The View remained fixed on the table where Harrison Ford and Sunny Hostin sat facing each other. Just moments earlier, Sunny had suggested that Ford's generation might have felt pressure to protect the system that gave them success. Now the room waited for his response. Ford didn't rush. He leaned back slightly, studying the table for a second before lifting his eyes again. His expression wasn't angry, but there was a seriousness there that hadn't been present earlier in the interview. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. You're talking about an industry that existed decades ago, he said slowly. Sunny nodded. Yes. Ford rested his hands together. And you're judging it using the expectations of today. A murmur ran through the audience. Sunny didn't interrupt. Ford continued. That doesn't mean the criticism is always wrong, he said. The admission caught some people by surprise. But it also means the context matters. Sunny leaned forward slightly. What kind of context? She asked. Ford glanced briefly toward the audience, as if gathering his thoughts. Back then, he said, most actors had very little power. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Even the successful ones? Ford nodded. Especially the successful ones. The audience shifted again. Sunny seemed intrigued. That's not how people usually imagine Hollywood, she said. Ford chuckled quietly. That's because Hollywood sells illusions. A few audience members laughed. But Ford didn't smile. Actors were employees, he continued, not decision makers. Sunny crossed her arms thoughtfully. But some actors had enormous influence, she said. Ford nodded. Yes, but influence isn't the same as control. The audience murmured again. Sunny tapped her notes lightly. So you're saying the power structure was different from what people assume? Very different, Ford replied. Sunny leaned forward again. Then let me ask you something directly. Ford looked at her. Go ahead. Sunny's voice lowered slightly. Did you ever witness behavior in the industry that made you uncomfortable? The question landed with a thud. Several people in the audience inhaled sharply. One of the co-hosts shifted nervously in her seat. Ford stared at Sunny for a long moment. The cameras moved closer. Everyone watching could feel it. This was the moment where the conversation could go somewhere unpredictable. Ford finally answered. Yes. The audience gasped. Sunny blinked. You did. Ford nodded slowly. I've been in this industry for 50 years, he said. Of course I've seen things that made me uncomfortable. The room grew completely silent. Sunny leaned closer. And did you ever speak about them? Ford paused. The hesitation stretched longer than anyone expected. Then he answered honestly. Not always. The audience reacted immediately. Some murmured. Others leaned even closer. Sunny's expression softened slightly. Why not? She asked. Ford sighed quietly. Because the world wasn't as simple as people think. Sunny didn't interrupt. Ford continued. Speaking out back then often meant destroying your own career. The audience grew still. And sometimes, Ford added, it didn't even change anything. Sunny looked thoughtful. So people stayed silent out of fear. Ford nodded. Fear, uncertainty, sometimes doubt. Sunny tilted her head. Doubt about what? Ford's voice became quieter again. About whether you understood the situation correctly. The audience murmured again. Sunny looked at him carefully. You mean people second-guess themselves? Ford nodded. Yes. He leaned slightly closer to the table. When you're young in an industry controlled by powerful studios, powerful producers, powerful executives, you learn quickly where the lines are. The tension in the room was almost tangible now. Sunny's voice softened. And those lines were hard to cross. Ford nodded. Very hard. A few audience members nodded in understanding. Sunny glanced briefly at the other hosts before looking back at Ford. But things eventually changed, she said. Ford nodded. Yes, they did. Sunny studied him. What made them change? Ford gave a small shrug. Time. The audience laughed lightly. But Sunny didn't smile. Just time, she asked. Ford paused. No, he said quietly. People. The audience leaned forward again. Ford continued. People who were brave enough to speak, even when it was dangerous. Sunny nodded slowly. And you respect those people? Of course, Ford said. Then he added something that surprised everyone. I wish more of us had been that brave. The audience gasped. A few people even clapped softly. Sunny looked genuinely surprised now. You're admitting that? She asked. Ford nodded. I'm human. The honesty seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the conversation. The tension that had filled the room earlier softened slightly. Sunny leaned back in her chair. That's probably the most honest answer we've heard today. The audience applauded warmly. But Ford raised a finger slightly. Honesty cuts both ways. Sunny tilted her head. What do you mean? Ford looked directly at her. I think people today sometimes underestimate how complicated the past was. Sunny considered that. Maybe, she said. Ford continued. But I also think conversations like this are important. The audience murmured in agreement. Sunny nodded. I agree. For a moment, it seemed like the tension between them had faded. But then Sunny said something that brought the intensity right back. There's one more question I want to ask. Ford sighed quietly, almost amused. I had a feeling. The audience laughed. Sunny leaned forward again. This one is simple. Ford waited. Sunny's voice became serious again. If you could go back, knowing what you know now. The audience leaned closer. Would you have spoken up more? The room went completely silent. Even the studio crew seemed to freeze. Because everyone knew this question wasn't theoretical. It was personal. Ford didn't answer immediately. He stared at the table for a moment, then slowly lifted his head. The look in his eyes had changed again. More reflective now. More vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that filled the entire studio. Yes. The audience gasped. But before anyone could react fully, Ford continued. And that's exactly why conversations like this matter. The room erupted into applause. But something about the look on Sunny Hostin's face suggested she still had one final thought. One final point. And if she said it, the conversation between her and Harrison Ford might reach an ending no one watching The View would ever forget. The applause rolled through the studio like a wave, filling every corner of The View. People were on their feet now, clapping not just because a celebrity had spoken, but because the conversation had become something deeper than anyone expected when the show began. At the center of it all sat Harrison Ford, his expression calm but reflective after admitting something very few stars of his stature would say publicly. If I could go back, yes, I would have spoken up more. Those words still hung in the air. Across the table, Sunny Hostin watched him carefully. The tension that had defined the earlier part of the conversation hadn't completely disappeared, but it had changed. Now it felt less like a confrontation, and more like a moment of reckoning. Sunny leaned forward slightly. You know, she said softly, that answer probably means more to people watching than you realize. The audience nodded in agreement. Ford tilted his head. Why's that? Sunny folded her hands together. Because honesty from powerful figures doesn't happen very often on television. The audience applauded again. Ford gave a small half-smile. I don't think of myself as powerful. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Harrison Ford, you're one of the most recognized actors in the world. The crowd laughed. Ford shrugged. That just means people recognize my face. Sunny smiled, but she wasn't done yet. But recognition creates influence, she said. Ford nodded slowly. That seems to be the theme of today's conversation. Another ripple of laughter moved through the audience. One of the co-hosts leaned forward. I have to say, she said, this might be one of the most intense interviews we've had in a long time. The audience clapped again. Sunny looked briefly toward the other hosts, then back to Ford. I know the questions were tough, she said. Ford gave a small shrug. Tough questions are usually the interesting ones. The audience murmured approvingly. Sunny studied him for a moment before speaking again. You didn't have to answer them. Ford leaned back in his chair. True. So why did you? Ford paused. For a second it seemed like he might dodge the question with humor, the way many celebrities do on talk shows. But he didn't. Instead, he gave an answer that quieted the entire room again. Because pretending the past was perfect doesn't help anyone. The studio went silent. Even the audience members who had been whispering to each other stopped talking. Sunny nodded slowly. That's a powerful statement. Ford's voice stayed calm. It's also a simple one. He leaned forward slightly. Every generation learns something from the one before it. Sunny watched him carefully. And sometimes the previous generation has to admit where it fell short. The audience broke into applause again. Some people stood. Others simply nodded with thoughtful expressions. The energy in the room had shifted completely now. Earlier, the tension had felt like a confrontation. Now it felt like something closer to understanding. Sunny smiled slightly. You know what's interesting? She said. What? Ford asked. I think a lot of people expected this conversation to end in an argument. The audience laughed. Ford chuckled quietly. Were you hoping for one? Sunny laughed too. Television ratings love arguments. The audience roared with laughter. Ford shook his head. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint the ratings department. The crowd laughed again. But Sunny quickly turned serious once more. There's one thing I want to say before we wrap up, she said. Ford nodded. Sunny looked directly at him. I respect that you stayed in this conversation. The audience applauded warmly. Ford nodded back. I respect the fact that you asked the questions. For a moment, the two simply looked at each other. Not as adversaries, but as two people who had just navigated a complicated conversation in front of millions of viewers. The show's producer signaled from off-camera. 30 seconds left. Sunny glanced toward the audience. Well, she said, I think today's discussion gave people a lot to think about. Ford smiled faintly. I hope so. But outside the studio walls, the impact of the interview had already begun spreading. Clips from the exchange between Harrison Ford and Sunny Hostin were already appearing online. Social media erupted almost instantly. Some viewers praised Ford's honesty. Others applauded Sunny for asking the difficult questions many interviewers avoid. Comment sections filled with debates. Ford handled that with class. Sunny asked exactly what needed to be asked. This might be the most real conversation on daytime TV in years. Media outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines appeared across entertainment websites. Unexpected tension on The View. Harrison Ford reflects on Hollywood's past. Sunny Hostin pushes for accountability in powerful interview. Back in the studio, the closing music began to play softly. Sunny turned back toward the camera. "Well, Harrison Ford," she said with a smile. "Thank you for joining us today." Ford nodded. "Thanks for having me." The audience rose to their feet once more, applauding loudly as the cameras slowly pulled back from the table. The moment had started with tension. It had passed through confrontation. And somehow it had ended with something far more meaningful. Reflection. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Harrison Ford handled the tough questions the right way? Or do you believe Sunny Hostin was right to challenge him so directly on The View? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy intense celebrity moments, shocking live television exchanges, and powerful storytelling like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to The Truth Narrator for more explosive and unforgettable stories from the world of entertainment. Because the next story might be even more dramatic.